Hrunting, the mythic sword that tested Beowulf's destiny. Have you ever trusted something completely, only to have it fail you at the worst possible moment? Imagine you're standing in total darkness, deep beneath the earth, facing a monster that has killed countless warriors before you. In your hand is a legendary sword, a weapon that has never failed in battle, forged with ancient magic and blessed by heroes. You swing with all your might, and the blade connects with the monster's flesh, but instead of cutting through, it bounces off harmlessly. The sword has betrayed you. Your life hangs by a thread, and the weapon you trusted is worthless. This isn't just a nightmare. This is exactly what happened to the greatest hero of Anglo-Saxon legend, Beowulf, when he wielded a famous sword called Hrunting. But here's the twist that'll keep you watching. Hrunting wasn't just any sword, and its failure wasn't just bad luck. This weapon holds secrets about fate, honor, and the very nature of heroism that scholars have debated for over 1,000 years. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this seemingly cursed blade might actually be one of the most important weapons in all of mythology, and why its failure was more significant than any victory. The story of Hrunting begins not with Beowulf, but with another warrior entirely, a man whose complicated relationship with heroism would shape the destiny of this legendary weapon. And what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about magical swords and heroic legends. Let me take you back to a time when England was called by different names, when warriors gathered in mead halls, when monsters lurked in the darkness beyond the firelight, and when the fate of kingdoms hung on the strength of a single champion's sword arm. This is the world of Beowulf, the oldest surviving epic poem in Old English literature, composed sometime between the 8th and 11th centuries. But before we can understand Hrunting, we need to understand the man who owned it first. His name was Unferth, and he was no ordinary warrior. Unferth held the position of Thyle in the court of King Hrothgar of the Danes, a role that's difficult to translate into modern terms. Some scholars interpret it as a kind of orator or spokesman, others as a ceremonial officer or even a court jester of sorts, but with far more gravitas than that term suggests today. Unferth's job was to sit at the king's feet and speak challenging words, to test visitors with verbal sparring, to maintain the social order through carefully deployed rhetoric. He was, in essence, the king's provocateur, licensed to question and challenge in ways that others could not. When Beowulf arrived at Hrothgar's hall, seeking to rid the Danes of the monster Grendel who had been terrorizing them for 12 long years, Unferth immediately challenged the young Geatish warrior. This wasn't mere rudeness. Unferth was doing his job, testing this foreign champion to see if he had the mettle to back up his bold claims. But there was something else beneath Unferth's challenge, something darker. Jealousy, perhaps, or shame. Unferth had not been able to face Grendel himself. None of the Danish warriors had. Night after night, they had heard the screams, seen the bloodstains, counted the missing, and night after night, they had done nothing because what could they do against such a creature? Unferth challenged Beowulf by bringing up an old story, a swimming contest that Beowulf had supposedly lost to a man named Breca. According to Unferth's version, Beowulf had foolishly boasted he could outswim his friend, but ended up losing after 7 nights in the ocean. It was a calculated insult, designed to make Beowulf look like a braggart whose reach exceeded his grasp, exactly the kind of man who would get killed trying to fight Grendel. But Beowulf responded with the true version of the story, explaining that yes, he had spent 7 nights in the frozen ocean, but during that time he had killed 9 sea monsters while weighed down with armor and weapons, protecting Breca from the creatures that attacked them. The swimming contest had turned into a monster hunt, and Beowulf had emerged victorious. The exchange between Unferth and Beowulf is crucial to understanding what comes later. Beowulf didn't just defend himself. He also made a pointed observation about Unferth. He noted that Unferth had killed his own brothers, a crime for which he would suffer in hell, and that for all his clever words, Unferth had never actually fought Grendel. If Unferth were as fierce as his words suggested, Grendel would not still be terrorizing the hall. It was a devastating counterattack, delivered with the force of truth. Now, you might be thinking, what does this have to do with a sword? Everything. Because that night, Beowulf did fight Grendel, without weapons, matching strength against strength, and he won. He tore Grendel's arm from his socket, dealing the monster a mortal wound. Grendel fled to his lair to die, and for the first time in 12 years, the Danes could sleep safely in their own hall. Beowulf had done what no Danish warrior could do. He had proven himself not just with words, but with the most extraordinary deed. But the story didn't end there. Grendel's mother, a creature even more terrifying than her son, came to the hall seeking revenge. She killed one of Hrothgar's most trusted advisors and carried off her son's severed arm. Now, Beowulf faced a new challenge. He had to track this creature to her lair, deep beneath a haunted lake, and fight her in her own domain. This was different from fighting Grendel. This time, he would need weapons. This time, he would need a sword. And this is where Unferth's story takes its most interesting turn. After being publicly humiliated, after having his failures thrown in his face, after watching Beowulf succeed where he had not even dared to try, Unferth did something remarkable. He approached Beowulf and offered him his sword. Not just any sword, but Hrunting, his most prized possession, a weapon with a reputation that preceded it. The poem tells us that Hrunting had never failed in battle, that it was an ancient heirloom, that its edges were hardened with poisoned twigs, tempered in blood, adorned with damascened patterns. This was a legendary weapon, and Unferth was placing it in Beowulf's hands. Think about what this moment means. Unferth, who had challenged Beowulf, who had doubted him, who had failed to act himself, was now entrusting his most valuable possession to the man who had shown him up. Some scholars interpret this as a moment of redemption for Unferth, an acknowledgement that he had been wrong, a gesture of respect toward true heroism. Others see it more cynically, as Unferth trying to associate himself with Beowulf's glory, or perhaps even hoping secretly that Beowulf would fail and die, removing the uncomfortable mirror that reflected Unferth's own inadequacy. The poem doesn't tell us Unferth's true motivation, and that ambiguity is part of what makes this moment so powerful. But here's what we know for certain. When Unferth handed Hrunting to Beowulf, he was giving him a weapon that carried its own story, its own reputation. Hrunting wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol. It represented the collective martial heritage of the Danes. It embodied the idea that some weapons are special, that they carry power beyond mere metal and edge. In the world of the poem, swords had names and histories. They were passed down through generations, from father to son, from lord to loyal retainer. A great sword was a character in its own right, a participant in the story of heroism. The name Hrunting itself has been the subject of scholarly debate. The etymology isn't entirely certain, but most experts believe it derives from Old English or Old Norse roots, suggesting something like thruster or plunger, a fitting name for a thrusting sword meant to pierce through an enemy's defenses. The name carries a sense of aggressive action, of a weapon that doesn't wait but attacks, that doesn't defend but pierces. It's a name that promises violence and victory. When Beowulf accepted Hrunting from Unferth, he wasn't just taking a weapon. He was accepting the weight of expectation. He was taking on the legacy of every battle this sword had won. He was trusting in the reputation of Danish arms and Danish heroism. And he was placing his life in the hands of a weapon forged by others, blessed by previous victories, but ultimately untested in the kind of battle he was about to face. The description of Hrunting in the original Old English poem is rich with detail. The poet tells us about the sword's construction, its tempering, its ornamentation. In Anglo-Saxon culture, the finest swords were pattern-welded, created by twisting together multiple strands of iron and steel, hammering them into a single blade, creating distinctive wavy patterns that looked like the scales of a serpent or the currents of water. These patterns weren't just decorative. They were signs of superior craftsmanship, indications that the blade had been made with exceptional skill and care. A pattern-welded sword was stronger and more flexible than a simple forged blade, less likely to break under stress, more likely to hold an edge. The mention of poison twigs in the tempering process is intriguing and has generated various interpretations. Some scholars believe this refers to an actual practice of quenching hot blades in organic materials, possibly believing that certain plants could impart special properties to the steel. Others interpret it as purely symbolic or poetic language, a way of saying the blade had been prepared with magical or ritual elements. Still others think it might refer to the appearance of the pattern welding itself, which could look like twisted branches or roots running through the blade. Whatever the literal truth, the effect is clear. Hrunting was no ordinary weapon. It was a sword of power, a blade that had been crafted with secrets and skill. The poem also tells us that Hrunting's edge had never dulled, that it had never failed any warrior who wielded it in battle, who trusted it when going against foes. This is crucial information because it establishes Hrunting's reputation. In the world of Beowulf, reputation matters enormously. Warriors live and die by their reputation. Their worth is measured by their deeds, and those deeds are remembered and retold. A sword with a perfect record, a weapon that had never failed, carried tremendous psychological weight. It wasn't just a physical tool, it was a guarantee, a promise written in the blood of previous victories. So when Beowulf descended into the dark waters of the haunted lake, wearing armor lent to him by Hrothgar, carrying Hrunting, he was as prepared as any mortal warrior could be. The poem describes his descent in vivid, unsettling terms. He sank for what seemed like the better part of a day through dark water, past strange creatures that snapped at him with teeth and claws. The mere, as the poem calls it, was not a natural lake. It was a place of supernatural dread, where the water itself seemed hostile, where even deer pursued by hunters would rather turn and face death than enter the water. This was a threshold between the world of humans and something else, something older and more primal. When Beowulf finally reached the bottom, he found himself pulled into a cave, a dry chamber beneath the water where some kind of roof kept the lake from flooding in. It was lit by an eerie light, what the poem calls a fire-bright flame that allowed him to see his surroundings. And there, waiting for him, was Grendel's mother. The poem is less specific about her appearance than it is about Grendel himself, referring to her as a she-wolf of the waves, a mighty mere wife, a creature of supernatural strength and rage. She attacked immediately, her grip stronger than any man's, her intentions clear. She would avenge her son or die trying. Beowulf swung Hrunting. The legendary blade, the sword that had never failed, came down with all of his considerable strength behind it. The edge, hardened with poisoned twigs, tempered in blood, adorned with the patterns of master craftsmanship, struck Grendel's mother full on the head. And nothing happened. The blade did not bite. It did not cut. The promised victory did not come. Hrunting, the sword with the perfect reputation, the weapon that had never failed any warrior, failed Beowulf at the moment of his greatest need. Imagine that moment. You're alone, deeper underground than you've ever been, in the lair of a supernatural creature, the water above you filled with monsters, your only light an uncanny flame, and the weapon you trusted, the sword that everyone said was invincible, has just proven worthless. This isn't a video game where you can reload a save. This isn't a movie where the hero has plot armor. In the world of the poem, this is a moment of absolute crisis, the point where everything could end in blood and darkness. Beowulf had killed Grendel with his bare hands, but Grendel's mother was fighting in her own lair, on her own terms, with advantages Grendel had not possessed. And now the sword had failed. What happened next reveals everything about Beowulf's character and about the deeper meaning of Hrunting's failure. He threw the sword aside. The poem says he cast it to the ground, this useless ornament, this betrayer. And then he trusted what had never failed him, his own strength, his own courage, his own determination. He grappled with Grendel's mother as he had with Grendel himself. She pulled him down. She drew a knife and tried to stab him, but his armor held. They struggled in the firelight, two beings locked in mortal combat, one fighting for revenge, the other for survival. Beowulf was losing. The poem makes this clear. Grendel's mother was too strong, too fierce, too filled with maternal rage. She had the advantage of fighting in her own lair, and she was not suffering from the wounds that had weakened Grendel during their battle. Beowulf's strength, mighty as it was not enough. This is important because it shows that the failure of Hrunting was not a minor setback, a momentary inconvenience in an otherwise easy victory. It was a catastrophe that put Beowulf on the edge of death. If the story had ended here, Beowulf would have been just another warrior who died trying to be a hero, another name on a long list of the fallen. Hrunting's failure mattered enormously. But then, as Beowulf's eyes searched desperately for any advantage, any weapon, any hope, he saw something. Hanging on the wall of the cave was another sword, an ancient blade of gigantic proportions, made by giants in the days before the flood. This was a weapon from a previous age, forged by beings more than human, a relic of powers and times long past. With a surge of desperate strength, Beowulf broke free from Grendel's mother's grip, seized this giant sword, and swung it with everything he had left. This time, the blade did not fail. It cut through her neck, killing her instantly. The supernatural weapon succeeded where the merely mortal sword, even a legendary one like Hrunting, had failed. After killing Grendel's mother, Beowulf looked around the cave and saw Grendel's corpse lying there. Even in death, the monster that had terrorized the Danes for 12 years filled Beowulf with righteous anger. He took the giant sword and cut off Grendel's head as a trophy. But then something remarkable happened. The blood of these creatures, Grendel and his mother, was so toxic, so supernatural in its properties, that it began to melt the giant sword's blade. The metal that had survived since the days of the giants, that had endured centuries or perhaps millennia, could not withstand the corrosive power of this monster's blood. The blade melted away like ice and fire, leaving only the hilt, which was ornately decorated with ancient carvings depicting the giant's destruction in the flood, a biblical reference inserted by the Christian monks who preserved this originally pagan story. Beowulf took the hilt and Grendel's head and swam back up through the lake. When he emerged, he found that the Danes had given up hope and left, assuming he was dead after so long beneath the water. Only his own Geatish companions had remained, loyal to the last, waiting for a return they had almost stopped believing would come. The sight of Beowulf emerging from the water, carrying the head of Grendel and the jeweled hilt of a sword older than memory, was a moment of triumph beyond imagining. When Beowulf returned to the hall, he presented Grendel's head to King Hrothgar and told the story of what had happened beneath the lake. And crucially, importantly, generously, he returned Hrunting to Unferth. He did not keep the sword even though it had failed him. He did not publicly shame Unferth for lending him a useless weapon. Instead, the poem tells us, Beowulf thanked Unferth for the loan, said that Hrunting was a good sword, and did not blame the weapon or its owner for what had happened. This act of courtesy, of maintaining Unferth's honor even though Hrunting had failed at the critical moment, tells us something profound about Beowulf's character and about the social codes of the world he inhabited. Think about what Beowulf did here. He could have humiliated Unferth. He could have held up the sword in front of the entire court and declared that it was worthless, that it had nearly gotten him killed, that Unferth had given him a false promise wrapped in steel. He could have used Hrunting's failure to further diminish a man who had already been diminished by his own cowardice and by Beowulf's previous success. But he didn't. He protected Unferth's reputation. He accepted the failure of the sword without casting blame. He demonstrated that true heroism isn't just about killing monsters. It's about how you treat other people, especially when you have the power to hurt them and every justification for doing so. This moment of grace has led some scholars to view Hrunting's failure in a different light. Perhaps the sword didn't fail because it was poorly made or because Unferth was unworthy. Perhaps it failed because Grendel's mother represented something that normal weapons, no matter how well-crafted or previously successful, simply could not affect. She was supernatural, descended from Cain according to the poem's Christian framing, a creature outside the natural order. A sword made by human hands, even a legendary one, might simply be categorically insufficient for such an enemy. Just as Beowulf had needed to fight Grendel without weapons to prove his strength was greater, he needed to find a weapon made by giants, by beings from before the flood, to kill Grendel's mother. Hrunting's failure, in this reading, was not a deficiency of the sword but a revelation of the nature of the enemy. This interpretation is supported by the fact that when Beowulf returns Hrunting to Unferth, he does not criticize it. The poem's phrasing is interesting here. Beowulf says the sword is good, that he thanks Unferth for its loan, and that he doesn't fault the blade at all. Some translations render this as Beowulf being simply polite, maintaining social courtesy even though the sword failed. But other scholars argue that Beowulf is being literally truthful. Hrunting was a good sword. It just wasn't the right sword for this particular enemy. Against any human warrior, any normal foe, Hrunting would have been devastating. Its reputation was earned honestly through many battles. But Grendel's mother was not a normal foe, and this battle was not a normal battle. The question of whether Hrunting truly failed or simply faced an enemy beyond its capacity is one of the great debates in Beowulf scholarship. On one side are those who see the sword's failure as a narrative device to increase the tension, to show Beowulf at his most vulnerable, to set up the dramatic discovery of the giant sword. In this reading, Hrunting fails simply because the story needs it to fail, because the hero needs to be pushed to the brink before he can achieve ultimate victory. The failure is mechanical, a plot point. On the other side are those who see Hrunting's failure as thematically significant, as saying something deep about the nature of heroism, fate, and the relationship between humans and the supernatural. In this reading, Hrunting represents human achievement and human limits. It is the best that humans can create, but there are enemies and challenges that lie beyond human scale, that require either inhuman strength, as Beowulf demonstrated against Grendel, or inhuman weapons, as he found with the giant sword. Hrunting's failure is the failure of normal excellence when confronted with abnormal evil. It's not that the sword is bad, it's that the challenge is beyond what any normal sword, no matter how good, can handle. There's also a third interpretation that's worth considering. Some scholars have suggested that Hrunting's failure is connected to Unferth's own moral failings. Remember that Beowulf had called out Unferth for killing his brothers, a terrible sin in the warrior culture of the poem, and an even greater sin in Christian theology, being a form of the first murder, Cain killing Abel. If Hrunting was tainted by association with Unferth's crimes, If weapons could carry the moral weight of their wielder's actions, then perhaps Hrunting was incapable of striking down Grendel's mother, not because she was too supernatural, but because the sword itself was compromised by Unferth's sin. In a world where reputation and honor are everything, where a warrior's deeds are believed to have almost physical consequences, perhaps a sword owned by a fratricidal man could not serve the cause of justice against even supernatural evil. This interpretation is complicated by the fact that the poem doesn't explicitly state this connection, but it's consistent with the symbolic logic of the world Beowulf inhabits. In this culture, things are not neutral. Objects, especially powerful objects like swords, participate in the moral and spiritual economy of the world. A cursed thing cannot do blessed work. A tainted weapon cannot strike a righteous blow. If Unferth's crime clings to Hrunting like an invisible stain, then the sword's failure against Grendel's mother makes a kind of poetic justice sense, even if it doesn't follow the rules of physics or metallurgy. But let's step back from these scholarly debates for a moment and think about what Hrunting means in the larger context of sword mythology across cultures. The idea of a named, legendary sword with its own personality and power appears in many traditions. In Norse mythology, we have swords like Hrunting, cursed to kill a man every time it was drawn and destined to cause 3 great evils. In the Arthurian legend, we have Excalibur, the sword that could only be wielded by the rightful king, which gave victory in battle, and that had to be returned to the Lady of the Lake. In Irish mythology, there's Fragarac, the sword of the god Manannan that could pierce any armor and force truth from anyone it was pointed at. In Japanese tradition, we have the 3 imperial regali, including the sword Kusanagi, which controlled the winds and was proof of the emperor's divine right to rule. All of these legendary swords share certain characteristics. They have names and histories. They are more than mere tools. They have been touched by magic or divinity. They often come with conditions or curses. They frequently pass from one owner to another, carrying their history with them. They embody the idea that some objects are special, that they participate in a larger story than just the functional use of a sharp piece of metal. And crucially, most of these legendary swords have moments where they fail or are lost or must be given up, because the hero's journey is not just about acquiring power, but about understanding its limits and sometimes transcending the need for it. Hrunting fits into this tradition perfectly. It is named, it has a history, it is described as special and powerful, it passes from Unferth to Beowulf and back to Unferth, and it has a moment of dramatic failure that shapes the story. What makes Hrunting particularly interesting is that its failure is not the end of its story. The sword continues to exist after Beowulf returns it. Presumably, Unferth keeps it, and presumably it goes on to serve well in subsequent battles, because there's no indication that it's destroyed or discarded. Hrunting's failure was specific, situational, not a sign of permanent worthlessness, but a moment of encountering something beyond its scope. This is different from many legendary sword stories where a weapon's failure indicates that it's cursed or broken permanently. When Siegfried's sword Gram shatters, it stays broken until it can be reforged. When Arthur's first sword breaks, he needs Excalibur to replace it. But Hrunting doesn't break. It doesn't shatter or crack or show visible failure. It simply doesn't cut when it should, and then it's returned to its owner, still whole, still potentially useful. The failure is not in the sword's physical integrity, but in its efficacy against a particular enemy. This suggests a more nuanced understanding of what makes a weapon legendary or powerful. In the Anglo-Saxon world that produced Beowulf, swords were incredibly valuable, not just as weapons, but as stores of wealth and symbols of status. A good sword might be worth as much as several horses or a small piece of land. The finest swords were treasured possessions that a man would pass to his son, that kings would give to favored warriors as rewards, that would be named and remembered. The description of swords in Old English poetry is often elaborate and loving, dwelling on details of craftsmanship and ornamentation in ways that might seem excessive to modern readers, but that reflected the genuine importance of these objects. Pattern-welded swords, like Hrunting apparently was, represented the height of early medieval metallurgy. The process of creating them was complex and time-consuming. Different types of iron and steel, with varying carbon contents, had to be heated, twisted together, hammered, folded, and hammered again, repeatedly, to create the characteristic wavy patterns and to produce a blade that combined flexibility with the ability to hold an edge. The knowledge of how to do this was specialized, passed from master smiths to their apprentices, and the best blades were worth fortunes. But even the best human-made blade had limits. Iron and steel technology in the early medieval period, while sophisticated in its way, could not produce weapons that were uniformly strong by modern standards. Blades could bend, crack, or break under stress. Edges could chip or roll over when they struck hard targets. A warrior had to know his sword's capabilities and limitations. He had to understand what it could and couldn't do. This practical knowledge of weapons' real-world performance likely informed the poem's portrayal of Hrunting. The audience would have understood that even a great sword might fail under extraordinary circumstances, might encounter an enemy whose bones were harder than the blade could cut, whose hide was thicker than the edge could pierce. Grendel's mother, being supernatural, could easily be imagined as having literally inhuman resistance to weapons. The poem emphasizes that she and Grendel are descendants of Cain, marked by God's curse, existing outside the normal order of creation. In medieval Christian thought, such beings might be essentially demonic, partaking of the same fallen angelic nature as Satan himself. Demons, in this worldview, are not physical beings in the normal sense. They are spirits who can take physical form, but whose essence is supernatural. A weapon that could harm a natural creature, even a very strong or dangerous one, might be completely ineffective against a demonic entity unless the weapon itself had been blessed or empowered by divine authority. This is why the giant sword succeeds where Hrunting failed. The giant sword is not from the ordinary world. It was made by beings who themselves were outside the normal human scale, creatures from before the flood, from the earliest days of the world when, according to biblical tradition, the boundaries between earthly and supernatural were more permeable. In Genesis, the giants are described as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, beings who violated the proper separation between divine and human realms. A weapon made by such beings might have properties that a human-made sword, no matter how skillfully crafted, could not possess. It might be able to affect supernatural flesh because it came from a supernatural source. The fact that this giant sword melts from Grendel's family's toxic blood is significant. It suggests that even this ancient, powerful weapon was not intended to survive its use against these particular monsters. The sword served its purpose, killing Grendel's mother and desecrating Grendel's corpse, but then it destroyed itself in the process, as though the mere contact with such evil was corrosive even to giant-made metal. Only the hilt survived, and interestingly, the hilt was what Beowulf brought back as treasure and proof. The hilt, with its ornate decorations and its images depicting the giant's destruction, became an artifact of memory and meaning, a reminder of both the victory and the cost, a symbol that transcended the mere functional use of the weapon. There's a parallel here to other mythological weapons that self-destruct or disappear after accomplishing their purpose. In some versions of the Arthurian legend, Excalibur must be returned to the lake after Arthur's death, disappearing back into the other world from which it came. In Norse mythology, various enchanted weapons have conditions or curses that limit their use or cause problems for their wielders. The idea seems to be that the most powerful weapons are not meant to be kept permanently, that they serve a specific purpose in the cosmic order and then must pass away or move on. Hrunting, by contrast, is a more humble and more enduring blade. It fails dramatically, but it survives to serve again, anchored in the mortal world and the realm of human achievement. When we talk about Hrunting's failure, we should also consider what it reveals about Beowulf himself. His response to the sword's failure is remarkably free of panic or despair. He doesn't freeze up or become paralyzed by fear. He doesn't waste time cursing the weapon or wondering why it failed. He adapts instantly, throwing the useless sword aside and falling back on his own strength. And when that proves insufficient, he looks for another option and finds the giant sword. This is the mark of a true hero in the poem's terms. Not someone who never faces setbacks or whose plans always work perfectly, but someone who can respond effectively to disaster, who can adapt when circumstances change, who doesn't give up even when the situation looks hopeless. Beowulf's heroism is tested more severely by Hrunting's failure than it would have been by easy success. If the sword had worked as advertised, if it had cut through Grendel's mother on the first blow, then Beowulf's victory would have been largely a product of having the right tool. It would have been a triumph of Danish craftsmanship and the reputation of a legendary weapon. But because Hrunting failed, because Beowulf was forced to the very edge of death and had to find victory through his own resourcefulness and luck, or divine favor if you read it that way, the triumph becomes truly his own. The failure of the sword paradoxically proves the greatness of the man who wielded it. This theme, that true heroism is revealed through how one responds to failure rather than through uninterrupted success, is deeply embedded in Beowulf as a whole. The poem begins with Beowulf as a young warrior full of strength and confidence, successful in every challenge he undertakes. But it ends with an old Beowulf facing a dragon, knowing he will likely die in the attempt, but going anyway because it's his duty as a king to protect his people. His companion warriors abandon him except for one loyal retainer named Wiglaf. Beowulf kills the dragon but is mortally wounded in the process. His life ends not with a triumphant victory, but with a bittersweet success purchased at the cost of his own death. The poem's view of heroism is thus tragic and realistic. Heroes can win, but they also suffer and die. Their victories are often temporary. The monsters keep coming, if not literally, then in the form of human enemies and the inevitable passage of time. Hrunting's failure early in the poem prefigures this more complex understanding of heroism and fate. It shows that even legendary weapons can fail, that reputation and past success do not guarantee future victory, that the universe does not always cooperate with human plans and expectations. This is a sobering lesson for a warrior culture that placed such emphasis on glory and reputation. Your fame, your weapons, your strength, all the things you've relied on and that have never failed you before, might fail you when you most need them. And when that happens, your true character is revealed. Do you surrender to despair? Do you blame others? Or do you adapt, persist, and find another way? The relationship between Beowulf and Unferth, mediated through Hrunting, is also worth deeper examination. Unferth represents a kind of warrior who is more common in reality than the Beowulf of the world. A man who has some courage and skill, who holds a position of respect, who possesses fine weapons and knows how to talk a good fight, but who has not been tested in the way Beowulf has, who has not had to face the absolute extremities of danger that separate the truly heroic from the merely competent. Unferth's challenge to Beowulf at the beginning of the poem can be read as the anxiety of the lesser man in the presence of the greater, the need to find some flaw or failure that will bring the hero down to a more manageable level. But Unferth's gesture of lending Hrunting to Beowulf, and Beowulf's grace in returning it without blame, suggests that the poem's ethics are not simply about celebrating the great and despising the lesser. Unferth, despite his flaws, is not portrayed as a villain. He is a man with limitations who nevertheless does what he can. He cannot fight monsters himself, but he can lend his sword to someone who can. He cannot match Beowulf's courage, but he can at least acknowledge it and support it in whatever way his nature allows. And Beowulf, for his part, does not need to humiliate Unferth to prove his own worth. He can be generous to a lesser man because his own glory is secure. The exchange of Hrunting thus becomes a moment of complicated human interaction, of pride and shame and generosity and social negotiation, all wrapped up in the transfer of a physical object. The fact that Hrunting fails adds an ironic layer to this exchange. Unferth gives Beowulf what he believes is a gift of power, a weapon that will ensure victory. But it turns out to be insufficient. Was this Unferth's fault? Did he know the sword would fail? Almost certainly not. Hrunting's reputation was honestly earned in previous battles. Unferth had every reason to believe it would serve Beowulf well. The failure was not a result of deception or ill intent, but of the fundamental uncertainty of the world. You can do everything right, provide the best help you're capable of giving, and still have things go wrong through no fault of your own. That's not a comfortable reality, but it's a true one, and the poem acknowledges it. If we step even further back and think about what Hrunting means to modern readers and scholars, we find that this sword has become a symbol for the complexity and sophistication of Beowulf as a literary work. For a long time, medieval literature was dismissed or undervalued by critics who saw it as primitive or simple, full of one-dimensional characters and straightforward morality. But close attention to elements like Hrunting's failure reveals that Beowulf is actually a psychologically nuanced work that grapples with difficult questions about heroism, fate, social relationships, and the limits of human power. The sword that fails is more interesting than the sword that always succeeds, because it opens up space for these deeper questions. Hrunting has also become a touchstone for discussions about how weapons function symbolically in literature. In fantasy fiction and video games today, magical swords are everywhere, and they almost always work exactly as advertised. The flaming sword burns, the vorpal blade cuts through anything, and the holy weapon destroys undead. These are power fantasies, wish fulfillment, the satisfaction of having a tool that is perfectly suited to its purpose and never lets you down. There's nothing wrong with that kind of story. It fulfills certain psychological needs and can be tremendous fun. But Hrunting reminds us of an older, stranger kind of story where legendary weapons are less reliable, where power is more ambiguous, where even the best equipment might fail you, and you have to rely on something less tangible, like courage or luck or divine favor or sheer bloody-minded persistence. Modern retellings and adaptations of Beowulf have handled Hrunting in various ways. Some stay faithful to the original, showing the sword's failure as a moment of crisis. Others minimize it or change it, perhaps because a failing legendary weapon doesn't fit contemporary narrative expectations. Some versions try to explain the failure more explicitly, adding details about why the sword didn't work, whether it's because of a curse, or because Grendel's mother had some kind of magical protection, or because Unferth's guilt had tainted the weapon. These additions can be interesting, but they also sometimes reduce the ambiguity that makes the original moment so powerful. The poem doesn't explain exactly why Hrunting failed, and that uncertainty is thematically appropriate for a story about navigating a world where outcomes aren't always predictable. In academic discussions, Hrunting has been analyzed from various theoretical perspectives. Marxist critics have looked at the sword as a symbol of the aristocratic warrior class's dependence on material goods and inherited privilege, with its failures suggesting the inadequacy of mere wealth and status when confronted with real danger. Feminist critics have examined how the sword fails specifically against a female monster, Grendel's mother, perhaps suggesting anxieties about female power and the inadequacy of phallic symbols, the sword, to control or dominate the feminine. Psychological critics have read Hrunting's failure as representing unconscious fears and anxieties, the fear that our tools and preparations will prove insufficient, the nightmare of impotence in a moment of crisis. Christian critics have seen the sword's failure and the success of the giant sword as an allegory of the insufficiency of earthly power versus divinely ordained means, with Beowulf's ultimate reliance on a weapon made before the flood suggesting that only pre-fallen or divinely touched instruments can truly defeat evil. Each of these readings brings out different aspects of the text and reflects different concerns of the readers and the ages at which they read. The beauty of a rich literary work like Beowulf is that it can support multiple interpretations without being exhausted by any single one. Hrunting means different things depending on what questions you bring to it, and all of these meanings can coexist because the poem itself is complex enough to contain them. One thing that all these interpretations share, though, is the recognition that Hrunting's failure is not a flaw in the poem but a strength. It complicates the narrative, adds depth to the characters, raises thematic questions, and makes the story more interesting than it would otherwise be. A story where Beowulf gets a legendary sword and it works perfectly would be satisfying in a simple way, but it wouldn't have the resonance, the staying power, the ability to generate discussion and interpretation across more than a millennium. The fact that we're still talking about why this sword failed, what it means, how it fits into the larger pattern of the story is a testament to the poem's enduring power and sophistication. Let's also consider Hrunting in the context of the poem's other treasures and objects. Beowulf is full of things: swords, armor, cups, shields, rings, necklaces, and helmets. These objects are constantly being described, given, exchanged, inherited, stolen, and hoarded. They represent wealth, honor, social bonds, and memory. When a lord gives a sword to a warrior, it's not just a practical gift of a useful tool. It's a statement of favor and expectation, a binding of the warrior to the lord through a web of reciprocal obligation. When a warrior inherits his father's sword, it's not just receiving property. It's taking on the weight of family history and the duty to live up to ancestral deeds. Objects in this world are dense with meaning and social significance. Hrunting participates in this economy of meaningful objects. When Unferth lends it to Beowulf, he's offering more than just a weapon. He's acknowledging Beowulf's superior heroism, perhaps seeking to associate himself with Beowulf's glory, perhaps genuinely trying to help, perhaps some complicated mixture of motivations. When Beowulf returns it without blame, he's maintaining the social fabric, showing that he understands and respects the codes of courtesy and generosity that hold warrior society together. The sword passes from hand to hand, and each transfer carries freight of meaning. But Hrunting is also interesting because it fails in its primary purpose while succeeding in its social purpose. As a weapon against Grendel's mother, it's useless. As a vehicle for the relationship between Unferth and Beowulf, it's extraordinarily effective. It allows both men to demonstrate important qualities: Unferth's willingness to help despite his own inadequacy, Beowulf's grace in accepting help and not humiliating those who offer it. The sword's physical failure enables its social success. This is a sophisticated understanding of how objects function in human communities, where the symbolic and relational dimensions can be more important than the purely functional. This brings us to a question that might seem strange, but is worth asking. Is Hrunting actually the most important sword in the story? It fails, after all, while the giant sword succeeds. The giant sword kills Grendel's mother and allows Beowulf to mutilate Grendel's corpse. By the logic of practical results, the giant sword should be the memorable one, the one people talk about. But in fact, Hrunting is the sword that has captured scholarly and popular imagination. People write articles about Hrunting. They name things after it. It appears in discussions and adaptations. The giant sword, despite its success, is less memorable, less distinctive. Why? Part of the answer is that Hrunting has a name and a story independent of Beowulf's adventure. The giant sword is discovered in the moment, used once, and then melts away, leaving only its hilt. It's a deus ex machina, a divine intervention or lucky break that saves the hero. It's necessary for the plot, but it's not really a character in the story. Hrunting, on the other hand, existed before Beowulf arrived and continues to exist after he leaves. It has been carried into previous battles by other warriors. It will presumably be carried into future battles. It has continuity and history. Its failure is a story about this particular sword, not just about any sword. Moreover, Hrunting's failure is more interesting narratively than the giant sword's success. Success is satisfying but not surprising in a heroic poem. We expect the hero to win eventually. Failure, especially the failure of something that was supposed to be reliable, creates tension and surprise. It makes the outcome uncertain. When Hrunting doesn't work, we genuinely don't know how Beowulf will survive. That moment of uncertainty makes the story more engaging. The giant sword resolves that uncertainty, but it's the uncertainty itself that creates the memorable moment. There's also something to be said for the fact that Hrunting represents normal, human excellence, while the giant sword represents something beyond the human scale. Most of us, as readers or listeners, can imagine possessing a weapon like Hrunting, well-made, reliable, with a good reputation. We can't imagine possessing a sword made by giants from before the flood. Hrunting is relatable in a way the giant sword is not. Its failure speaks to our fears about our own tools and preparations failing us. The giant sword's success is encouraging in a fairy tale way. It tells us that salvation can come from unexpected sources, but it doesn't engage our everyday anxieties the way Hrunting's failure does. Let's talk about how Hrunting has appeared in modern adaptations and retellings of Beowulf. Over the past century, there have been numerous versions of the story in various media: novels, films, comic books, video games, plays, and more. Each of these has had to decide how to handle Hrunting and its famous failure. Some adaptations keep the scene largely as it is in the original poem, with the sword failing and Beowulf having to find another weapon. Other adaptations change things, sometimes significantly. In some versions, Hrunting doesn't fail so much as prove insufficient. The sword might wound Grendel's mother but not kill her, suggesting that it's a good weapon that's simply being used against an exceptionally tough enemy. This is a subtle shift from the poem, where the sword explicitly does not bite, does not cut at all. By making the sword partially effective, these adaptations reduce the starkness of the failure and make it more about Grendel's mother's extraordinary toughness than about Hrunting's inadequacy. This changes the thematic emphasis somewhat, but it can work well in a visual medium where you want to show the sword doing something rather than just bouncing off harmlessly. In other adaptations, Hrunting's failure is explained by Unferth's moral failings or by an explicit curse on the weapon. This makes the failure more explicable and less ambiguous than it is in the poem. A cursed sword failing is easier to understand than a good sword failing, and audiences may find it more satisfying. But again, this removes some of the uncertainty and ambiguity that makes the original moment so interesting. If we know the sword is cursed, its failure is expected rather than surprising. the tension is reduced. Some adaptations minimize or eliminate Hrunting entirely, having Beowulf go into battle against Grendel's mother with his own weapons or with no weapons at all. This simplifies the plot and removes a potentially confusing element, especially for audiences unfamiliar with the original poem. But it also loses the entire subplot of the relationship between Beowulf and Unferth, the social complexity of the sword exchange, and the thematic richness of the legendary weapon's failure. These adaptations trade narrative complexity for streamlined storytelling, which is a defensible choice, but it does mean that something is lost. One particularly interesting adaptation is the 2007 film directed by Robert Zemeckis, which makes several significant changes to the story but keeps Hrunting. In this version, Unferth is portrayed as openly cowardly and bitter, and his lending of Hrunting to Beowulf is more clearly an attempt to associate himself with Beowulf's glory. The film also implies that Unferth might be secretly hoping Beowulf will fail and die, removing the source of his shame. This makes Unferth a more straightforwardly antagonistic character than he is in the poem, where his motivations are more ambiguous. The film's Hrunting still fails against Grendel's mother, but the context of that failure is different because the character dynamics have changed. In video game adaptations, Hrunting often becomes a collectible weapon or a reward, a piece of equipment with certain stats and abilities. This is almost the opposite of its role in the poem, where it's defined by its failure rather than its success. But video game logic demands that weapons be reliable and quantifiable. A sword that randomly fails when you most need it would be frustrating for players, ruining the gameplay experience. So game versions of Hrunting typically either eliminate the failure entirely or recontextualize it as a cutscene moment that doesn't affect gameplay. This is necessary for the medium, but it does mean that the weapon's most distinctive characteristic in the original story is lost. What all of these adaptations and interpretations show is that Hrunting is a challenging element to translate out of its original context. The sword works perfectly in the poem because the poem is operating according to a certain set of literary and thematic logics, where ambiguity is valuable, where failure can be meaningful, and where weapons can have complex symbolic roles beyond their practical function. But many modern storytelling contexts prioritize different things: clear causation, reliable systems, or streamlined narratives. Hrunting doesn't always fit easily into these different frameworks, so it gets changed, simplified, or removed. Each adaptation makes choices about what to keep and what to discard, and those choices reflect different understandings of what makes the story work and what matters most in the telling. For scholars and serious readers of Beowulf, though, Hrunting remains fascinating precisely because it doesn't fit neatly into simple categories. It's a legendary weapon that fails. It's a gift that doesn't work. It's an object that succeeds socially while failing practically. It's a named sword that's less important than an unnamed one. All of these paradoxes make Hrunting a rich subject for analysis and discussion. The sword embodies the complexity of the poem itself, which refuses to be reduced to simple morals or straightforward adventure. Let's return to the beginning of this exploration and think about what we've learned. I started by asking you to imagine trusting something completely and having it fail at the worst possible moment. That's what happened to Beowulf with Hrunting. But what we've discovered through this deep dive is that this failure was not a simple disaster, but a complex event with multiple meanings and consequences. It tested Beowulf's character and revealed his true heroism. It illuminated the relationship between Beowulf and Unferth. It demonstrated the limits of human-made power against supernatural evil. It created narrative tension that made the story more engaging. It has provided material for scholarly debate and interpretation for over 1,000 years. Hrunting's failure teaches us something important about storytelling and about life. The most interesting moments are often not the ones where everything goes according to plan, but the ones where plans fail and people have to adapt and improvise. The most revealing tests of character come when circumstances are difficult, when our tools and preparations prove insufficient, when we have to fall back on our inner resources. A story where the hero gets a legendary sword, and it works perfectly, why is satisfying in a certain way, but it doesn't challenge us or make us think. A story where the legendary sword fails forces us to confront harder questions about what really matters, what makes someone heroic, what we can rely on, and what we can't. In the end, Beowulf survives his encounter with Grendel's mother not because of Hrunting, but despite its failure. He survives because of his own strength, courage, resourcefulness, and willingness to keep fighting even when things look hopeless. And maybe that's the point. Weapons are useful, preparation is important, but in the most extreme circumstances, in the darkest moments when everything is on the line, what matters most is the quality of the person who holds the weapon, not the weapon itself. Hrunting's failure clears away the comfortable illusion that having the right tools guarantees success, and forces us to confront the starker reality that sometimes success depends on qualities that can't be forged in a smith's fire or passed from hand to hand as a gift. This is not a comfortable lesson. We like to believe that if we prepare enough, if we get the right equipment, if we follow the right procedures, we can ensure good outcomes. And most of the time, that's true. Most of the time, having a good sword is better than having a bad one. Most of the time, Hrunting serves its wielder well. But not always. Not against every enemy. Not in every situation. There are moments when even the best preparation is not enough, and those moments reveal what we're really made of. Beowulf returns Hrunting to Unferth with grace and courtesy, not blaming the sword or its owner for what happened. This act of generosity is itself heroic in a different way than killing monsters. It shows that Beowulf understands the limits of mortal achievement and doesn't hold Unferth responsible for the fact that his best weapon wasn't sufficient for a supernatural enemy. It shows that Beowulf values the social bonds and codes of courtesy that hold society together as much as he values martial prowess. It shows that true greatness includes the ability to be kind to those who are lesser, to protect their dignity even when you have every justification for diminishing them. The story of Hrunting, then, is not really about a sword at all. It's about what the sword reveals, about heroism and its limits, about the relationship between humans and the supernatural, about social bonds and how they're maintained, about failure and adaptation, about the difference between reputation and reality, about the complex ways that objects carry meaning in human societies. The sword is a lens through which we can examine all of these larger themes, a physical object that opens onto questions of psychology, ethics, metaphysics, and social organization. Throughout the history of literature, there have been many famous weapons. Some are remembered for their great victories, for the enemies they slew and the battles they won. Hrunting is remembered for its failure, for the moment when it didn't work, when it left its wielder vulnerable and forced him to find victory through other means. That's unusual. That's special. That's why, more than 1,000 years after the poem was composed, we're still talking about this sword, still trying to understand what its failure means, still finding new angles and interpretations that shed light on the text and on ourselves. If you've stayed with me through this entire exploration, you now know more about a single sword from medieval literature than most people know about anything. But more importantly, you've seen how a close examination of one element from a literary work can open up vast territories of meaning and interpretation. Hrunting is not just a prop in an adventure story. It's a carefully constructed element of a sophisticated narrative that has survived for over a millennium because it engages with fundamental questions about human existence. What can we rely on? What happens when our preparations fail? How do we respond to crises? What makes someone truly heroic? How do social relationships work? What are the limits of human power? The genius of Beowulf, and of Hrunting's role in it, is that these questions are embedded in an exciting story rather than presented as abstract philosophy. We don't need to have read Aristotle or Aquinas to grasp what the poem is exploring. We just need to pay attention to what happens. A man gets a legendary sword. The sword fails. He survives anyway and returns the sword gracefully. The surface story is simple and dramatic. The depths beneath that surface are profound and endlessly interesting. As we come to the end of this journey through the story of Hrunting, I want you to think about your own life. Have you ever had a Hrunting moment? A time when something you trusted completely failed you when you needed it most? Maybe it was a relationship that you thought was solid but turned out to be fragile. Maybe it was a skill or ability that you'd relied on that suddenly proved inadequate. Maybe it was a belief or assumption about the world that circumstances revealed to be false. These moments are painful, but they're also revealing. They strip away our comfortable illusions and force us to discover what we're really capable of when our usual tools and strategies don't work. The question is not whether we'll have these moments, because everyone does eventually. The question is how we'll respond to them. Will we be like Beowulf, adapting immediately, looking for another way, refusing to give up even when things look desperate? Will we be like Unferth, lending what help we can, even if we can't solve the problem ourselves? Will we be gracious in our failures and our successes, maintaining the social bonds that hold communities together? These are choices we make, consciously or not, every time we face a crisis. Hrunting failed Beowulf, but the story didn't end there. He found another way. He survived. He achieved his goal. And then, crucially, he came back and dealt generously with the man who had given him the useless weapon. The failure of the sword was not the end of the story, but a pivotal moment that tested and revealed character. That's true in literature, and it's true in life. The next time something fails you at a crucial moment, think of Hrunting. Think of how a legendary weapon proved insufficient, but the hero survived anyway. Think of how failure can be more revealing and ultimately more important than easy success. Think of how the ability to respond to setbacks with courage and grace and resourcefulness is more valuable than any tool or weapon, no matter how legendary. These are the lessons that Hrunting teaches us across more than 1,000 years, and they're as relevant now as they were when the poem was first composed in the halls of Anglo-Saxon England. The story of Hrunting reminds us that we are more than the tools we use, more than the preparation we make, more than the advantages we possess. At the deepest level, we are our response to challenge, our courage in the face of fear, our resourcefulness when plans fail, our grace under pressure. These qualities can't be forged by a smith or bought with treasure. They have to be developed through experience and choice. They have to be tested in the fire of a real crisis. And when they're found to be true, they are more valuable than any legendary weapon. So yes, Hrunting failed, but Beowulf did not. The sword bounced harmlessly off Grendel's mother's hide, leaving the hero defenseless in a monster's lair deep beneath a haunted lake. It was a moment of absolute crisis, the kind of moment that ends stories with the hero's death. But it didn't end that way. Beowulf found another way. He survived. He won. And then he came back and returned the failed sword with courtesy and thanks, maintaining the social fabric even as he transcended the limitations of mortal weapons. That's the story of Hrunting, a legendary sword that failed at the crucial moment, and by failing, revealed something more important than any victory: the true nature of heroism, the limits of human achievement, the importance of grace and generosity, the necessity of adaptation and persistence. It's a story that has resonated through more than a millennium of literary history because it touches something fundamental about the human experience. We all face moments when our tools fail us. What matters is what we do next. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for taking this deep dive with me into the story of a single sword from a 1,000-year-old poem. I hope you found it as fascinating as I have. I hope you see now that Hrunting is not just a minor plot point, but a window into the sophisticated artistry and profound themes of one of the greatest works in English literature. And I hope that the next time something fails you at a crucial moment, you'll remember Beowulf's example. Adapt, persist, find another way, and when you emerge victorious, be gracious to those who tried to help, even if their help proved insufficient. The story of Hrunting is the story of how failure can be more meaningful than success, how testing reveals truth, and how the deepest heroism is not measured by the weapons we carry, but by how we respond when those weapons fail. It's a story that speaks across the centuries because it speaks to something timeless in the human condition. We prepare, we hope, we trust in our tools and our plans, and sometimes those tools and plans fail us. What happens next defines who we are. In the world of Beowulf, Hrunting continues to exist somewhere, presumably still in Unferth's possession, still a good sword with a reputation for never failing in battle, because its one failure was situational, not a sign of permanent inadequacy. The sword failed against a supernatural enemy that no mortal-made weapon could affect, but it would still serve well against human enemies, against normal challenges. Its story is not over. Its usefulness is not exhausted. It simply encountered a challenge beyond its capacity, and there's no shame in that. Perhaps that's the final lesson of Hrunting, that encountering something beyond our capacity is not failure in the deepest sense. True failure is not trying, not adapting, not persisting. True failure is giving up when things get difficult. True failure is letting a setback define us permanently. Hrunting didn't fail in that sense. It was insufficient for one specific task, but it remained what it had always been, a well-made weapon with a proud history. Beowulf recognized this, which is why he returned it with honor and thanks. We too will face challenges beyond our capacity. We, too, will encounter situations where our best tools and preparations prove insufficient. When that happens, we have a choice. We can see it as ultimate failure and give up, or we can see it as Beowulf did, as a revelation of the true nature of the challenge, as an opportunity to find another way, as a test of our deeper qualities. The tools may fail, but we don't have to. This is why Hrunting matters. This is why its story has endured. This is why scholars continue to debate its meaning and writers continue to adapt it. Because it embodies a truth about human existence that we need to hear again and again. That preparation and tools are valuable, but not sufficient. That failure is not final. That true heroism emerges not from having the right equipment, but from having the right character, the ability to respond effectively when everything goes wrong. The next time you face a crisis, when your best-laid plans crumble, when your trusted tools fail you, when you find yourself in darkness facing something that shouldn't be possible, remember Hrunting. Remember that even legendary weapons can fail. Remember that heroes survive not because they have perfect tools, but because they refuse to quit. Remember that grace and generosity matter as much as strength and courage. Remember that the failure of a sword is not the end of the story, but a pivotal moment that reveals what really matters. Hrunting failed, and in failing, it taught us more than any sword that simply worked as expected ever could. It showed us the limits of material power and the necessity of inner strength. It demonstrated that reputation and past success don't guarantee future victory. It revealed the complexity of human relationships and the importance of social grace. It opened up questions about fate, providence, and the relationship between human and supernatural realms. All of this from a sword that didn't cut when it was supposed to, from a moment of failure in a 1,000-year-old poem. That's the power of great literature. It takes something specific in particular, a named sword in an Anglo-Saxon epic, and makes it speak to universal human experiences and concerns. Hrunting is not just Hrunting. It's every tool that's ever failed us. It's every time our preparation proved insufficient. It's every moment when we have to find resources within ourselves that we didn't know we had. It's every experience of being tested beyond our limits and discovering that we can survive anyway. The sword is a symbol, and symbols are how stories speak truths that transcend their specific circumstances. So this is the story of Hrunting, the mythic sword that tested Beowulf's destiny by failing him at the crucial moment. It's a story about weapons and monsters, about heroes and halls, about gifts and courtesy, about failure and success. But more deeply, it's a story about us, about what it means to face challenges that exceed our capacity, about how we respond when our best isn't quite enough, about finding grace in difficulty and strength in vulnerability. It's a story that has survived for over a millennium because it speaks to something fundamental and true, something that resonates across cultures and centuries because it touches the core of human experience. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. Thank you for sticking with me through 22,000 words about a single sword from medieval literature. If you found this valuable, if you've discovered something new about Beowulf, or about storytelling, or about yourself, then please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who might appreciate a deep dive into the hidden meanings of ancient literature. There are so many more stories like this waiting to be explored, so many more seemingly small details from great works of literature that open up into vast territories of meaning. This is what literature does at its best. It gives us stories that entertain on the surface while resonating with profound truths beneath. Stories that we can return to again and again and find new meanings each time. Hrunting failed, but its failure made a story that has lasted more than 1,000 years and will last 1,000 more. That's a kind of success that no victory in battle could match. The sword that didn't cut has cut more deeply into human consciousness and culture than any blade that simply worked as expected. And Beowulf, who trusted the sword and survived its failure, remains one of the great heroes of world literature, not despite that failure, but in some way because of it, because it showed us who he really was when everything went wrong. This is the story of Hrunting, and it's been an honor to share it with you.